Hello everyone, my name is Kangkang Kovacs. I'm making this video for Professor Rogers' New Romanticism class. In this video, I will be putting Mary Shelley's The Last Man in conversation with three contemporary feminist dystopian novels: Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Rain, and Naomi Alderman's The Power. As we all know, Mary Shelley is the first female author who started a trend of both science fiction with her Frankenstein, which was really popular, and The Last Man, which is considered the first, one of the first, if not the first, post-apocalyptic or dystopian novel. Very much in its current sense, where world building and dystopia is in trend. She started that trend, so Mary Shelley is pretty cool. I am really excited to make this video. I find The Last Man fascinating, and I just think it's really cool to put it in comparison and I want to trace the parallel theme and trace the influence Shelley had on some of our greatest female writers in our own time. For example, the characterization in The Last Man really rings eerily similar with certain characters in Handmaid's Tale by Atwood. The wife's character, Serena Joy, the handmaid's character, Alfred, they all share certain psychological traits, problems that has been teased out in Mary Shelley's The Last Man, but it's just been magnified to a certain extent. So I will be talking into much more detail about that. I also hope to not just compare, but also contrast The Last Man with these three novels, because although a lot of the same problems in Mary Shelley's time is still very much confronting us in our own time in terms of feminism and racism, people have looked at it, tackled it very drastically different. So I want to talk about gender performativity, which is a big thing explored in The Power by Naomi Alderman. It is already manifested in The Last Man, but it's magnified in The Power, that specific aspect. I also want to talk about ethnocentrism, or frankly, racism. That is, is the underlying force in a lot of early feminist novels. So me coming from the background of Asian American writer, that voice, that perspective is important to me, and I have a heightened awareness to it just because of my own race. I see the ethnocentrism really being a driving force in a lot of apocalyptic stories, from Mary Shelley to even our contemporary writers. And the question is why, and how does that differ or share similarity with dystopian novels written by writers of other race, in which there isn't a world where European culture or Christian culture is considered the center and is very much in danger. So that's why I included Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Rain. She comes from a very different angle, and she featured a lot of African mythology and Caribbean voodoo culture. And I think that would be very interesting when put side to side with The Last Man, in which there is this virus coming from the East. And there's, a fair share of Islamophobia and cultural ethnocentrism in The Last Man. So I want to really explore that with a Black writer's work. So I think these are all very interesting topics. I will be quoting a lot of contemporary scholars and critics' paper in supporting my view. And I will assume that you've already read The Last Man, so I won't go into the plots and background of that very much, but I will introduce the three contemporary novels a little bit before diving into the comparison and contrast. And I hope, whether you've read any of those three novels or not, or whether you plan to, which I highly recommend. They're really good stories. I hope this video will shine a new light and maybe create some depth in your interpretation of Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which is an amazing book. So without further ado, let's get started. A quick introduction on the writer Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She was born in 1797. Her father was William Godwin. Her mother was the famous feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Shelley, her husband Percy Shelley, drowned in 1822 when his sailboat sank in a storm. And in 1826, 4 years after Percy Shelley's death, The Last Man was published. Mary Shelley stood by her mother's ideology and remained a radical thinker and supported young writers and helped out socially ostracized women throughout her life. She died in 1851 of possible brain tumor. And now a quick summary on Percy Shelley's life. So Percy Shelley was an avowed atheist throughout his life. He was radical, he was an egalitarian dedicated to social justice and nonviolence. He supported island independence and Greek War of Independence. He advocated parliamentary reform, he was a republicanist, and he advocated for ending aristocratic privileges. All of these are very familiar when you take Adrian's character into view. So he advocated also for free love. He spoke up against marriage, the institution of marriage. He also advocated for vegetarianism. And I quote a New Yorker article about Percy Shelley written years ago with this really nice illustration of Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley. I think this is their tour in Ireland. The woman in the background is supposed to be a poor Irish woman. They were struggling with, not having an agency, autocracy towards birth, towards reproduction right in Catholicism. And quote, Shelley's radical ideals were inseparable from a kind of moral arrogance. This will be a theme that I hope to explore further in this video, about the radical ideals and the moral arrogance. And now I want to quickly talk about the 4 waves of feminism, a brief history of modern feminism. The first wave of feminism is usually pre-1920. It really can be traced all the way back to Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and her book, Vindication of Rights of Women. Now, it is not an easy read, like it suggests on the title, and there's also a lot of problems with it, as we will talk about it later. In the 19th Amendment that was passed in 1920 was a benchmark for the first wave because it finally fulfilled the principal goal of the feminist first wave, that is guaranteeing white women the right to vote. Black women and other minorities did not get to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The second wave, from 1960 to 1980-ish, was inspired by the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, the passage of Equal Pay Act, 1965, and the Roe v. Wade, 1973. In fact, reproductive freedom is by far from something we can take for granted, both in feminist dystopian literature, like The Handmaid's Tale, and in our own near future. And the third and the fourth wave, I'm pretty much launching them in one, is from post-1990. They become more inclusive when it comes to race and gender issue and more focused on rape, sexual harassment. The fourth wave lasts all the way till present day. And this is a picture taken from the Women's March in 2017.
How is the harvest in your country?
We have challenges like the rest of the world. Most of our staples are not adjusting to the new weather patterns.
Our citrus orchards in Florida are doing really well.
Oh, Rita, could you check and see if we have any oranges?
Yes, sir.
I believe we do.
Good. I hope we'll find other valuable resources to share with you as well.
God has blessed our new nation, thank you, in so many ways.
Yes. I'm curious. How does the quiet half of the room feel about Gilead?
It's absolutely wonderful.
Mrs. Waterford?
I'm blessed to have a home and a husband to care for and follow.
Traditional values are at the core of everything we do here, including trade policy.
Never mistake a woman's meekness for weakness.
Clever.
Yes, it is. It's from A Woman's Place.
My wife's book.
I reread it on the plane. Such a thoughtful argument for domestic feminism, as it was called.
Thank you. That's very kind.
I heard you speak once at a rally. Before the war, you were very passionate.
Women were abandoning their families, and we needed to make a change. We were running out of time.
You were arrested for inciting to riot, if I recall.
I had a temper in those days.
Back then, did you ever imagine a society like this?
A society that has reduced its carbon emissions by 78% in 3 years.
A society in which women can no longer read your book. Or anything else.
No, I didn't. God asks for sacrifices, Mrs. Castillo. That has always been his way, but he gives the righteous blessings in return, and I think that it's safe to say Gilead has been blessed in so many ways.
Amen.
So that was a interesting little clip. It was, I took it from the Hulu series, The Handmaid's Tale. I really liked that adaptation. I thought it was good writing and good acting. My only complaint is that it's way too long. It dragged out many, many seasons after the original plot in Atwood's book ended. So that was my only complaint. For those of you who haven't read the book or watched the series, I'll just give you a really quick summary to get you up to speed. Basically, in Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, it is a post-apocalyptic society where the whole world, the whole society of what used to be America is now run by a theocratic, sort of like a Christian fundamentalist group called the Gilead Society. And this is very, very patriarchal and extreme misogyny. Women were divided into 6 categories, you know, and they're based completely on your birthrights and procreational function. If you're fertile, then you're a handmaid. If you're highborn and infertile, you're a wife. I mean, there's a little bit more nuance than that, but pretty much women are just walking incubators or, you know, sex slaves in the society. They don't have their own names. The wives do have their own names. If you're handmaids, you don't even have your own name. If you're the handmaids of Commander Fred, for example, you're Offred. Now, they've lost their names, they've lost their identity and voices altogether. Now, Serena Joy, she was the founding mother, interestingly, of Gilead. She was the thinker and fighter and political activist that helped form Gilead. She wrote the book, The Woman's Place, mentioned in the video. The only problem is now she has to live in a society she created for herself. And this is a party they hosted at Serena Joy's home to talk about trade negotiation with the Canadian and Mexican diplomats. And I believe the other woman is a Mexican ambassador, and she challenged, she kind of confronted Serena Joy and asked her, like, how do you like Living in a society you created yourself. Are you in a good place personally? So I picked this clip to be read or to be watched side by side with Shelley's The Last Man. I will be selecting a couple of sections of The Last Man and talk about it. For me, there are some really eerie similarities that's mirrored in The Last Man. So let's take a look at them. So if you read this is a quote from The Last Man. It's said by Vernie or Leon, Perdita's own brother, about Perdita's feeling towards Raymond, her husband. And does it ring eerily similar with what Serena Joy claims in that party? So I just thought that's really interesting. Suparna Banerjee, I'm probably butchering her name, she wrote several amazing papers that explore the characters Perdita and Mary Shelley's attitude towards gender role division in the family. And Banerjee is being very insightful here, I think. She sees Perdita's death as an embodiment of Mary Shelley's recognition that the gender-determined role of devoted wife within the bourgeois family is inherently suicidal, because the wife submerges her identity into that of her husband, sacrificing herself to his welfare. And this is a reflection by Perdita. This is one of those out of character moments, which was very touching to me as a reader, when she finally reflects on her love and her commitment to this marriage and where that led her. And there was a lot of bitter regret, a lot of bitterness in her inner voice. And Mary Shelley's voice came through in this moment, I really think. Now, several papers really explored this gender stereotypes and the harm of that. One paper, the Squares paper, really interestingly explores the suicide of Perdita and how her tragedy is actually a result of a lack of boundary. She is so understanding and loving that she has lost the boundary of her own self. She's trapped. She's a trapped victim. And she lost herself in her enthrallment with her powerful lover, which ultimately leads to self-destruction and suicide. And here, Mary Shelley actually traces that gender inequality to its roots, I think. And this is a point argued by Banerjee as well. That root, according to Shelley, is the romantic notion of love. The expectation for women to lose herself, or even as we still say in our language, to fall in love. To fall suggests you're losing your footing, you're losing control, you are reduced, right, from a high place to begin with. And it's just fascinating to me that Perdita and Serena, they essentially both chose this upon themselves. They were enslaved by their own agenda. They lost their subjectivity in order to fulfill a gendered narrative. I mean, there is the external element. They lived in society where this was really the alternative is not an option, but they also were willing complicit in this. They gave up their individuality in exchange for the identity of a beloved, devoted, romanticized damsel and a virtuous wife. And that is really the saddest thing. I would like to quote the famous French philosopher and feminist Simone Beauvoir here. Her famous line, "One is not born a woman, but rather becomes one." Woman, the other gender, is made by society rather than a biological fact. There's really a lot that goes into the making of a female, of femininity. The rigid stereotypes that dehumanizes and objectify women seem to be rather popular among a lot of women, a lot of well-educated ones, both in the case of Shelley's Last Man and in Handmaid's Tale. I read a couple Iranian scholars, their paper that quote heavily Judith Butler, one of the famous feminist critics too. And they talked about in Gilead how the subject's identity rests upon the social norms and regulations that define their subjectivation and grant them their identities in return to conform to the norms. So really that is a huge reason why people fall for this, for the rigid stereotypes. And like Perdita gave up her individuality in the name of love. Serena Joy did the same thing in the name of a lot of things, but love was one of them. In Seek for Power, but also in Seek for Love. Essentially, people do that not because they like to be dehumanized, not because they like to be objectified, but because there's a gain on the other end. Is that if I do this, I can fit in. I can, by conforming to this rigid social norm, this rigid gender narrative, I can obtain in exchange a new identity. And there's tremendous comfort in obtaining a secure identity, in conforming. So now we're on to the second book. This is Naomi Alderman's The Power. It's published in 2017. It is arguably one of my favorite feminist dystopian novels. It is not an easy read, but it's extremely well written. This is a very special story because Naomi Alderman, she is an English writer. She's heavily influenced by Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood praised this book a lot, and it reads a lot like an Atwood novel. But in this book, Alderman imagines this post-apocalyptic world where women gained power instead of women being abused and objectified. But they gained power through this complete chance incident because of pollution initiated during the Second World War. Women at certain points, I think it's around teenagehood, most women started growing an electric skein on their collarbone. And over time, girls will learn how to use electric skein to create electric shock waves. And they can actually, kind of like the evolutionary development of electric eels, they can shock their prey, they can shock each other. And the really powerful ones in the book, they can create, lightning bolts. She who cuppeth lightning in her hands. That is why there is this hand on the cover. And men do not grow the electric skein for whatever reason. Nobody knows. And over time, the apocalyptic world, Alderman imagines, women started overpowering men physically. And with this physical dominance comes mental and psychological dominance, and comes the entire uproot of social structures. And so the entire society is shifting from a traditional patriarchal society to a matriarchal society. And Alderman really explores what of it, what becomes of it. And ultimately, I don't want to, give complete spoilers, but she has a very dark vision of what it means to switch from a patriarchal society to a matriarchal society where everything is flipped on its end, power is redistributed, but the same violence and greed and manipulation exists across gender. It is, she's not afraid to really explore what happens when victims suddenly get power, but the old narratives and the old social structure that condones violence is still there. What happens then? Maybe instead of becoming liberators, the victims will become abusers themselves. And so I think it's a fascinating book. It has received a fair amount of critical review, although because it's relatively recently published. There's not a ton of critical research done on the book. Most of them are like really high praises. This book won a lot of awards, but there are also, very interestingly, some of the harshest criticism against this book come from feminist writers themselves. Because this book ultimately, and I'll go into more detail later, the story really touches one branch of feminism, the feminist separatism, which is an ideology. I think it came around during the second wave, or at least it initiated from the second wave of modern feminism, when women started imagining, you know, a world with, or a subculture with only women that are exclusive to men. And there's this, you know, common notion that women are more peaceful, we're born to be peacemakers and nurturers, and women are more empathetic, we're better at communicating, and more and more feminists really are vouching for this like separatism ideology, where and you see this reflected in a lot of modern feminist dystopian novels, where you've got this building that is only inhabited by women, and it's a little utopian society amidst a world of chaos and violence created by men. That this notion that the world would be a better place if there were less men, or if men were to be more feminine. But essentially at the heart of all this separatism ideology, I think, at the heart of the separatism is the belief of dichotomy, is this male versus female, or feminine versus masculine dichotomy. And there's a lot of serious problems with this dichotomy. For one, you know, where do you put the queer people, the transgender? Well, I know lesbianism is highly celebrated in the feminine separatism ideology, because it's like the less we can deal with men, the better. But, you know, they're not always open to transgender and the queer population. There's also a lot of confusion as to like where the queer population should fit in. Are they to be excluded or included? There's also just, unfortunately, the separatism, the feminist separatism, really reinforces gender role-playing and gender dichotomy in its own way, because there's this notion that to be feminine is good and to be masculine is bad. But as we all know, real human being all falls on the spectrum, and we're all a combination of all these isms. That's in my opinion anyway. You can't really, if you start rigidly dividing a real person and real personhood into these roles, whether you're butch, you're feminine, you're, you know, then you're essentially doing what the Handmaid's Tale, what the Gilead Society is doing to its women. You're categorizing them. You're dividing up the role, and everybody gets to own up to a rigid identity while disowning other parts of their real self. And so I see a lot of problem with the feminist separatism. And this book really tackles that idea. It actually challenges the notion whether women are born to be more peaceful and empathetic to begin with, or is that a learned skill or a surviving skill as a result of generations and generations of oppression and abuse? Is the role of a peacemaker and a nurturer just another performance for the female gender? I think that's a really good question to be asking by a book. So I want to, for example, I want to talk about the a couple characters that, you know, a couple lines that really represent, like, manifested some eye-opening questions in this book. There's the character Margaret, and she is a politician. She eventually ran for the president and became, or I guess she didn't become the president, but she became very powerful in the end. When she first started sensing this electrical skein in her body, and it was even her teenage daughter who awoke this ability to electrify people from her. She was, she went through phases. She was very worried, and she tried to conceal that. She doesn't want to be viewed as a threat by her coworkers and by her, especially male coworkers, or her constituents. But eventually, she came across this threshold, and she realized there is immense power that's contained in the ability to physically overpower somebody, to physically harm someone. So I want to read this line here, this paragraph. This is Margaret in her office, listening to her couple of her male coworkers talking. Thinking this, Margaret feels very far from the table, where Daniel's mouth is still flapping open and closed like a goldfish. She is in a high and lofty realm, a place where the lungs fill with ice crystals and everything is very clear and clean. It scarcely matters what is actually happening. She could kill them. That is the profound truth of it. She lets the power tickle at her fingers, scorching the varnish on the underside of the table. She can smell its sweet chemical aroma. Nothing that either of these men says is really of any great significance, because she could kill them in 3 moves before they stirred in their comfortably padded chairs. It doesn't matter that she shouldn't, that she never would. What matters is that she could, if she wanted. The power to hurt is a kind of wealth. The power to hurt is a kind of wealth. A really large notion of this book is built on a very dark premise that people in power hurt because they can. Sometimes there are no intelligent explanation. There are no complicated motivation why they choose to abuse a certain victims, why they choose to behave certain way. They do it because they can. It is a exercise of power. And the power, according to the world Naomi built, the power started from physical dominance. When Margaret realized she could kill her coworkers, these 2 men she's never liked, in 3 moves in her office, it does not matter whether she would do that. She never would. But being able to physically dominate over them suddenly makes them seem very trivial to her. And this actually led up directly to her speaking up against them. And she started behaving like a man. All her tones, her choice of words, her just even body language started becoming more masculine. And she refused to be interrupted. She interjects when her male coworkers are speaking, and she trivializes and dismisses them with kind of sexual jokes when they're trying to make a point. She's really like starting to, like the toxic masculinity that goes around in the work office a lot is coming around, except for this time she is the initiator. And for her, this whole change started from the realization that she has physical power over men. So that's one very interesting description. Also, another thing that resonates with Margaret's line is the entire book is assumed to be written by a male writer. This book was written at a time that I think is a couple thousand years from now, when our world has already come to an end, and the newer species or the newer generations of human beings all the women have developed the electrical skein, and women became the more dominant, the more physically dominant, the more violent sex among the two in this future world. And it's been that way for thousands of years. And so that has become the norm. And in this new world, the post-apocalyptic world, men are, they have gotten used to a very, very different role in society. They are the homemakers, they are the peacemakers, they are the nurturers, and women, takes all the consequential, significant jobs in the market. And even like in terms of this book, it's supposedly written by a male writer, an emerging male writer. And he sends his manuscript to Naomi Alderman, who is, her character in the book is this very well-established older female writer. And he sends her this entire manuscript. In the beginning of the novel, it says, Neil wrote this book, and he sends it to Naomi to ask for her advice. Any feedback is, very much appreciated. And you go through this whole book, and Naomi, her character, writes back to Neil. And what did she say? She commented, those feisty men trying to provoke a war. Some of us had fantasies like that. Can I confess? Shall I confess that while thinking about this, no, I can't confess it. It's not just me though, my dear. A whole battalion of men in army fatigues or police uniforms really does make most people think of some kind of sexual fetish, I am afraid. That was, so imagine, you're this emerging writer, and you've put your heart and your life into writing this 400-page book manuscript, and you send it to a established writer for some opinion and possibly some advocacy and support, and you get this in return. This is the first feedback he gets, is this letter, I'm afraid your description of men wearing uniform patrolling the street would really just remind most readers some kind of sexual fetish. Like, you are not going to be taken seriously for these kind of description. And she then says, I feel instinctively, and I hope you do too, that a world run by men would be more kind, more gentle, more loving, and naturally nurturing. Have you thought about the evolutionary psychology of it? Men have evolved to be strong worker homestead keepers, while women, with babies to protect from harm, have had to become aggressive and violent. The few partial patriarchies that have ever existed in human society have been very peaceful places. This, of course, reads deeply ironic, but it's done in this way for this precise purpose. Because, to be honest, this is an ancient trope in modern literature and in among modern critics even. You come across this a lot of times, where writers would say, they view women or female characters as nurturers, as peacemakers, and how many times have you or I heard of the comment, a world made up of women are probably naturally more peaceful. Everybody would just be caring for babies and helping each other, creating arts and poetry, and there's no wars. If we elect a female president, there would never be any war. Literally taken the words out of Tim O'Brien's novel, although he put it in a more vulgar way. So this is it's an ancient trope. But is that true though? Because Naomi's novel, throughout her 400-some pages, explored what happens when the world is taken over by women, but with the same narratives and social structures that condone violence. That women are not any less violent than men. They were engaged in drug dealing, infanticide. They were able to commit gang rape, and they started a global war that ended up extinguishing all the human race, that was compared to the flood. So, and so in a way, it can be read as very anti-feminist, but in a way I think is deeply challenging one of the oldest tropes of feminism, especially feminist separatism. Is femininity really more peaceful, really less violent, more empathetic than masculinity, or is that a myth? And even more so, is that a discriminating myth? Is that just reinforcing gender division and gender role playing? So I think that is really interesting because, especially when looked together with Mary Shelley's The Last Man, because this kind of narratives of what a woman should behave like, what a woman should think, or how a woman should act when she is in love, or what a woman is expected to do when she is betrayed or when she has lost her love, when she is deserted. The Last Man is filled with this kind of expectations, and I see them as very, very performative. All Mary Shelley's female characters are highly gender coded, and they all rise up to a certain very, very one-dimensional and rigid expectation. They're playing their role in the novel, and they rarely act out of character. There's a couple times when, Perdita or Evadne acted out of character, but it's very rare. So in the following the slides, I want to explore that. I want to quote some The Last Man section to really explore this gender performativity and this trope enforced by women writers themselves upon women readers, of how you should, where your place is in the world, and how you should behave when you're in love, how you should behave when you lose your love, what your identities and your roles are. So I think it's really interesting to really look at that and to challenge that. Because ultimately, like as the Power says in the book, gender is a shell game. SHELL is a shell game. What is a man? Anything that a woman is not. What is a woman? Anything that a man is not. Tap on it and it's hollow. Turn it over, there's nothing inside. So I picked these conversations, this paragraph from The Last Man. This was a conversation between Leon and Perdita when her marriage with Raymond is falling apart. Okay, so we can read this. And I was thinking when I was constructing this slide, how can we look at it from a performative perspective? I see it essentially as a performance. Perdita has a expectation. She's conditioned to think a certain way of what women should behave like once they fall in love. How they should be devoted, how they should tame their own temper, lose their own selves for the other, for the better half, for the better soul, how they should sacrifice and serve. And it's almost like these scriptures, these scripts were passed down to her through generations, even though she was a wild shepherd girl who grew up in the country. Somehow they got to her still. And that is how she performed her own love life. And as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of Madame Bovary the novel written by French novelist Flaubert. This just bears so much similarity. Flaubert, wrote that his main character, Madame Bovary, she grew up reading all the pop romantic novels at her time, which, Flaubert teased about because he thought they were rubbish. But all these little stories that Madame Bovary grew up reading was just all these chivalrous knight saving damsel, conquering, going through journeys and finally meeting their real love, and how women just, fall head over heel, lose themselves completely once they find their knight. And Madame Bovary basically tried to reconstruct her own reality according to that. She kept on falling in love with men that are not her husband. And it's almost like she falls in love with the notion of falling in love. She doesn't really care about who her lover really is. She's just keeping on wanting to propel that role that she read in a novel, highly romanticized lover. And in the end, it did not work out because it turned out that all her male counterparts were not participating in that performance. At the end of the day, they were all very realistic to their money and their time. And Madame Bovary realized that she was the only one in that show, that her lovers were not going along. They gave her the illusions they were, but they were not. And so this really bears similarity with Perdita's tragedy. You can see Raymond is not on that same page. All this devotion and selfless love and sacrifice, this very spiritual, otherworldly obsession, he is not reciprocated from Raymond. And this is Perdita's own show in a large sense. Now, I want to talk about the Madonna versus whore complex, which plays a huge factor in characterization of Perdita versus Evadne. So the Madonna versus whore, or the virgin versus whore complex, is actually a concept brought up by Freud. It's very, very interesting, deeply entrenched in Christianity. This is a mentality that is still quite common among men nowadays. You see women as either a virgin or a whore, and there's no in between. It's too polarized extreme. A Madonna or a virgin is somebody who's pure, who's passive, who's virtuous and selfless. You'll see a lot of these adjectives. They all ring very similar. A virgin or a Madonna is not sexually driven. They're usually portrayed as asexual. Or even if they are sexual, they do have sexual desire. They're extremely shy or reserved about it. And they are the characters that are the wife figure. They're girlfriend material, they're wife material. They're the kind of women you can see being the mother of your children. And that is Perdita, right? The whore character, the whore archetype, are women who are not falling into that previous group. They're usually women who are, unapologetically sexual, who are not passive in their sexuality, and are come across more confident, leading the way, and they threaten the masculinity in one way or another. And men, demonize them as the whore, treat them as one. So Evadne really rings that tone, even though her character is more nuanced, but she really is. She's built according to that whore archetype. She was portrayed as the home wrecker. She brought upon the rift between Raymond and Perdita in their marriage. She's the seducer, and she not only broke another couple's marriage, but she also brought upon the curse of plague in the book. It was her curse that originated the plague in Constantinople that eventually spread across the world and became a global pandemic. And so that's a pretty big tag to be putting on her character. So I'll read a couple lines. Perdita, even where she loved, was reserved and timid. Such a violet with sweet Perdita, trembling to entrust herself. Like, there's all these adjectives that are very familiar: trusting, devoted, affectionate, shy, innocent. Even though Perdita was a wife and a mother, she remained that level of innocence because she is a Madonna, while Evadne is the whore, and so she is more beautiful, more sexually, well, I don't want to compare who's more beautiful, but she's more sexually oriented. And she's viewed as the siren. And so I think it's just interesting. It's also a little bit frustrating that a feminist writer as Mary Shelley would construct her main female characters that falls into the Madonna versus whore complex.
We as Black people are not placed in the future. The world that's projected in Blade Runner looks nothing like our world. Women and women of color are also in the future, and we're also in positions of power in the future. And that is exactly why we've done the movie Brown Girl Begins.
No matter how boar hide under sheep's wool, and grunt still betray him.
Translation.
The world of Brown Girl Begins, the film, all the wealthy have fled to downtown Toronto. There's no electricity, there's no water, there's no politicians. And the poor have been marginalized and sent to an island.
Hey, what's the rule? We don't steal from anyone that helps us.
The whole political idea of Afrofuturism stems all the way back from the 60s and the 70s and the nationalist movement in terms of how do we bring Africa to where we are, and how do we think about Africa, the motherland, in a futuristic kind of way. For me, Afrofuturism is much more simple. It's more, how are we going to see Black people in the future? And how can we place Black people in the future? So for me, when I did Brown Girl Begins, it was all about placing a young, Black, Caribbean woman in the future in a position of power. If we're looking back and we're looking at Black History Month, we're looking at us in terms of our shared experience in a position of oppression and revolution and fighting back, but mostly the mainstream tends to look at us in oppression. And Afrofuturism for me is a movement that looks at us as a movement of putting ourselves in the future, not depending on anybody else, and in a position of power.
I don't want to kill a chosen one. I want to give you the power that you were meant to have.
Then give me the power to see.
My idea of what it'll be like for artists in the future, Black artists in the future in Toronto, is that we're still going to have the same challenges of racism and sexism, in the sense that those barriers aren't going to disappear, because then I would be talking about a fantasy, and I deal with sci-fi, not fantasy. But what I do think is that there will be more stories and more access to those stories than we have now. And I think that the idea of multiple identities in the Black community, rather than one monolithic African-American stereotype Black identity, there'll be multiple and diverse identities that are accepted.
That's all you got, baby girl?
I think if I had seen this film when I was growing up, that it wouldn't have taken me so long to think it was okay to tell my stories.
So putting Mary Shelley's The Last Man in conversation with Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Rain is actually really fascinating for me. It's really exciting because I'm finally getting to what I'm most intrigued by. That is the perspective switch. In Bales or Bailey's, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but Bailey's paper, she really has a very interesting point about which character Mary Shelley identifies herself with in The Last Man. I think we can all see that Perdita is a character that Mary Shelley projects a lot onto, the mournful widow, because Adrian is really projected as seen as a romanticized version of her husband, Percy Shelley, who drowned in the end. But as Bailey's point out, Mary Shelley also projects herself into Leon's character as well, the lone survivor, the last man. It's really both these characters combined forms a more whole picture of the author's point of view. There's also a lot of the survivor's guilt in Mary Shelley as an author that we can really just sense from the story and the characterization. She has a lot of the guilt just being the sole survivor of her own marriage. The fact that she survived Percy Shelley is kind of like, for her, to an extent, and I buy this argument, to an extent, this is like surviving the apocalyptic disaster and being the last man. And so that is really interesting, the fact that she really identifies with both Leon and Perdita makes it more than a gender thing, makes her perspective. It's also a racial thing. As we can see, Leon is politically involved, as Adrian is in the story, and Mary Shelley really portrayed the English race as, I quote, this beloved race. In the beginning of the story, we see they were going through the republicanization, and eventually it succeeded through nonviolence. And you can see that's something that's in line with the author's own ideology, and she is quite proud of that. And she really is putting the British people in this perspective as almost like God chosen, or the beloved race, or more interestingly, I want to use the phrase innocence, the innocent race. It's almost as if sin is not originated from the mainland England. Sin originated from elsewhere in the world and is brought upon by the greedy. Mary Shelley sees the expansion, and this is why a lot of scholars like to argue that The Last Man is a severe criticism towards colonialism and expansion, because essentially this plague is brought upon by men's greed for power and conquer. This is brought upon by all these boats that travel to Constantinople, that travel to America and come back, that they bring the disease. While, if it were up to the women, if it were up to characters like Perdita, for example, Perdita, I keep on pronouncing her name wrong, Perdita, or Adrian, if it were more up to them, there would be not only more of a familial harmony, but maybe the plague or the disaster would never get to England, or maybe we would have been better prepared. It would not have happened so fast. And so this also rings very familiar in the post-COVID, or in some countries it's certainly not post-COVID. It's very much in the midst of it. In a post-COVID in United States environment, this is a narrative that rings very, very familiar. That the disease or the pandemic is not homeborn; it is brought to us by others, by these culturally othered population, by these other cultures, and we're the victim here. And if it weren't for a cultural mingling, a globalization, then maybe we would have been spared. We were the beloved race that, that the disaster fell upon us. And so so that is one thing, one main reason I want to put Mary Shelley's Last Man in conversation with the brown girl in the ring, because I want to look at like why, this notion of innocence, this notion of like almost like, a European, a civilized innocence that runs really throughout the story. There's a lot of Islamophobia, how, the plague really originated from Constantinople, and it also was brought upon by a boat from America, a contaminated boat, while we are innocent, or at least there's a strong sense that the women at home in England were innocent. Women and men at home were innocent. This is very interestingly contrasted by Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Ring, this notion of innocence. Because I think at the heart of this notion of innocence is it's a bourgeois sense of innocence. It's a sense, like the saying goes, I want to eat meat, but I don't want to know how I want to eat sausage, but I don't want to know how it's made. It's that bourgeois sense that, I want to reap the benefit. I want to be, pampered and in comfort, but I don't want to know all the cruel things that goes on in creating the sanctuary that I'm enjoying, essentially. I really see that sense of innocence as privileged people wanting to close their eyes to the suffering of others, essentially. In Brown Girl in the Ring, the entire tragedy is created because a white woman politician she needs a heart transplant, but she wants to make a point against animal cruelty. She does not want to use a pig's heart. She wants to make a point about, having her heart donated from a human being, because this would help with her campaign. And lo and behold, they can't find a willing donor, so she essentially had to have her people resort to the ghetto area in Toronto, the area that's given up, that's infested with crime and poverty and drug abuse. They have to go there and, befriend this this drug dealer and this lord, evil lord, to get a healthy human heart. And all the tragedy and murder and horror in the story essentially resulted from a white woman's need for a healthy heart. But does this politician know anything about the murder and the sacrifice and the blood that went on because of this desire? Because of her desire? No, she doesn't know, and she doesn't need to know. She doesn't want to know either. For her, I would presume that, she sees herself in this place of innocence, that I need a heart, and, I'm fighting against animal cruelty, but I don't want to know how this heart is obtained. It's just, it is that sense of innocence when you're in the position of privilege and you do not want to open your eyes to what's going on in other cultures, in more marginalized cultures. And so that also, another point that video talked about is the fact that how before this, Afrofuturism is a relatively recent concept, because in dystopian literature, there really isn't many Black people as major characters, and a future or a apocalypse, whether it's a utopian or a dystopian future, Black people do not visualize themselves in it. And you can, a darker way of putting it is also that Black people and other cultures have essentially gone through apocalyptic disaster in their reality. A lot of the apocalyptic theme in dystopian literature really mirrors slavery, genocide, which all these notions were very much a concrete reality for a lot of other nations. But they come across very fictional and dystopic within a white middle class group of readers. So this is this is really fascinating for me because Nalo Hopkinson was born in the Caribbean islands, and she did not move to Canada until she was a older child. And so she went through her period of cultural shock. And even though she became a very powerful writer of the English language, she was never quite able to see herself as Canadian. She's always kind of been caught in a slack, in a groove between two cultures. And throughout her life, she was very, very fascinated with voodoo mythology and Caribbean folklores. And she talked extensively about this cultural mingling, this multiculturalism that she has experienced, which is, that versus the ethnocentrism. So in the Brown Girl in the Rain, there is this concept of obeah, which I'll hopefully find a video to show it. Obeah is a black magic or a kind of voodoo that was very popular in the Caribbean culture. A lot of people were scared of it. It was also used as a religious practice and a political gesture because former slaves would use obeah as an excuse to gather and to revolt against slave owners. And so obeah was essentially illegalized by the white slave traders in the Caribbean islands, and it was illegal in Canada for a while. So her characters in Brown Girl in the Rain, several major characters, really just they have a very hostile impression towards obeah. It is, it's all hostile. It's black magic. It's evil, and they don't know what it is at all. They just know like people who are involved with this witch and wizards, and we need to stay away from them. They are to be feared and alienated and ostracized by the Black people in the community. She really touched this phenomena of the Black Canadians, the Black Canadian diaspora disowned their own culture, a part of their own culture. They were Christianized, they were whitewashed, and obeah and voodoo mythology and all that was very alienating for them. They do not want to have anything to do with that. And Nalo Hopkinson has mentioned in her interviews, that is unfortunately one way for cultures to mingle. That is, when we talk about multiculturalism, that is often what happens, is that instead of having different cultures really seeping into each other and combine with each other, you have a dominant culture taking center stage and marginalizing and really demonizing the other cultures. And over time, the traces of the Black mythology and the Caribbean folklore still exists, but they exist very much in the negative way, in the dark, hostile kind of way in people's gossips. While the white European, the Christian culture takes dominance and is portrayed in the better light. So that is one way, in reality, multiculturalism works. And as a Black writer, she had to really fight against that trend and do a lot of research and also just do a lot of research on obeah, but also do a lot of research on Black people's reaction to obeah in Canada, around Toronto, and like why that is the case. This crazy phenomena of disowning your own culture in order to assimilate into another culture. So that is interesting because in The Last Man, ethnocentrism is a huge thing. And Mary Shelley kind of did work both worlds and kind of got I think she took the benefit from both worlds because she did portray this Greek War of Independence. She described their journey towards Constantinople, and you know, there's very much the sense of adventure. And she later on, while she was tracing the progression of the pandemic, she talked about, you know, the palaces in China and the very densely populated areas in Turkey, and all, you know, in Senegal, the rice coast in West Africa. She really spanned out with her writing, and it gave you a sense of multiculturalism. I mean, you have to essentially when you're describing a global pandemic, right? There is that openness. There is that, you know, cosmopolitan, you know, feel to it. But when it comes down to it, though, the European culture, especially the English culture, you know, this whole nonviolent, evangelical, republicanism, very much with a strong dose of Greek heritage, Greek lineage, that takes the center of the stage. While all these other cultures, especially Muslim in her case, was portrayed, was touched, but it was used as a backdrop. And what's worse, is used as a backdrop. You know, it has a negative light shown on it. It has a Islamic phobia light shown on it. And these other cultures essentially were portrayed as the source of the plague. So just, you know, that is multiculturalism on the surface, but ethnocentrism in the core. I just thought to put that in comparison with Brown Girl in the Rain is very interesting. So I was really hoping to find a video about obeah, but I realized that they're all at least 10 minutes long. And I am running out of time for this video. So if you are interested, you can always check out. It's really fascinating. It's O-B-E-A-H, obeah. You can, rich history can be learned. Okay, so back to the last point I want to talk about in between, for the comparison between Last Man and Brown Girl in the Rain. I want to talk about the post-humanism in Mary Shelley's The Last Man and in Brown Girl in the Rain. These are very different genres because Brown Girl in the Rain is often seen as an Afrofuturism. It's not just a feminist dystopian piece of literature. And first, I need to get back to what I talked about in the previous sub-video about this notion of innocence, which I find fascinating because it comes from the sense that I am in the center of the world, that the Euro-American or the European cosmic view is the center of the world. We're the beloved race, as we talked about. We are the innocent, we're the God-chosen, and all the bad things, the plagues, befall on us as a punishment because of our own greed, but they befall on us from somewhere else. So this is actually a running theme in a lot of feminist dystopian literature, not just in Mary Shelley's work. This notion of innocence or the loss of innocence or punishment, that the disaster fall upon a certain race or the disaster fall upon a certain group of people because they are victimized or because, they lost their innocence, is actually a running theme. And it is interesting when you put that side to side with Afrofuturism, because there is also a sense of innocence in Afrofuturism novel, but it's a rather different sense of innocence. And the sin is also very different. So, for example, in The Last Man, the innocence part comes from sticking to, all the British notion, all the British ways, which includes British moral and civilization. There is a strong sense of, that nature, the shepherd or the nature, but that's also a very Christian idea. And if you look at Adrian's character, he, is a nature lover. He is a gentle soul, but he is also a monarch. He was a monarch, and he, later on, stepped up and ran the country. He was a political figure. And he's very much invested in all the social hierarchies, of the existing. He had a lot of Reformation ideas, but he's also very much a part of that system, right? And so that is, sort of where the innocence comes from, is adhering to tradition in The Last Man. And the sin part comes from unknown, comes from other cultures, comes from journeys to strange land and meeting strange people. That is where the disaster befalls. That is where sin comes from. While in Afrofuturism, for example, in Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Rain, it is very much switched. The roles are switched. The innocence in this case comes from, or I will start with the sin first. The sin in Brown Girl in the Rain comes from essentially capitalism. If I were to pinpoint one word to symbolize the sin or the loss of innocence in Nalo Hopkinson's story, it would be, I can say greed, but it would be capitalism. And she really went into detail constructing that narrative. The capitalism corrodes people away, whether it's Black people or white people. It creates these social hierarchy, these gaps in social economic classes, and that is where detachment happens. Then that is, with detachment comes the disintegration of community and the disowning of culture, and from that generates violence. And so capitalism is the original sin in Nalo Hopkinson's story, while the innocence comes from this pre-colonialism sticking to being in one with nature and embracing all the possibilities. And so I just find that to be amazing. These two books, when looked shoulder to shoulder, are essentially a complete reversion of each other in their depiction of innocence versus sin. And also I'm going to quote Kate Singer's article in the end here, when she talked about posthumanism and environmental, this relation with nature, this doing away with civilization. I read that article. It is brilliantly written. It is, she really tackled a lot of concepts, which I find it, just to be, it's really intriguing. Every single one of them, I feel like a mini paper can be written about it, or a long paper can be written, and to just have them all combined into one. There's a lot to talk about. There's also, in Mary Shelley's case, to talk about posthumanism feels just a little bit off for me, because I feel like racism and ethnocentrism and sexism were very much prevalent, was still prevalent I do not feel like I was ready to engage in a conversation about post-humanism or the relation between human and objects or human and nature, when the relation between human and human, between different races and genders is still very much unresolved. And so, like, for example, the latter part of The Last Man, when civil war broke out, who initiated the civil war? Well, it's the Irish immigrants, it's the Irish refugees. And Mary Shelley really did portray the refugees during the pandemic in a pretty negative way. And these are the American and Irish immigrants who came from the poor country, and boatloads of them, swarmed the British coastline, and they brought the plague. And they not only brought the plague, they started looting and rioting in our countryside. They do not respect social order. They were, they were abusing the hospitality of our good countrymen, good old country gentlemen. So, it's also a very familiar narrative from just a couple years ago in this country, right? So, that same narrative towards refugee and immigrants in any circumstance is troubling. So when you have still like a lot of that going on, I just did not feel like it's immature timing to be talking about too much about post-humanism. But I do find that really intriguing, that paper, because especially after I read Leah Williams' paper on post-humanism in Black dystopian literature. Because essentially, post-humanism, in its sense, the deconstruction of civilization and deprioritization of civilization in the Western tradition is very much where African or some other cultures in Asia, it is the starting point. It is a instinctive belief, and it is in a lot of their tradition. If you take folklore in Caribbean, folklore or voodoo or obia, for example, or I am Chinese American, I can think back on all the Chinese classics. The emphasis on being one with nature and the emphasis on human beings are like not anything more special than a bird, is prevalent among the elite class in Chinese literary tradition. And if you look at American Indian tradition folklores, that is very, very much the case. They're not called post-humanism. They were just there throughout. And so this whole concept of post-humanism, this deconstruction of civilization, this putting human back into its place with nature, into its non-special place in nature, I see it as a reaction to Christianity, which, makes a lot of sense in Western culture, but it is kind of a weird, it is a weird notion when you look at it from the perspective of another culture that did not put humans in that special alienated position away from nature in the first place. So I would quote this line from Liam's paper that when you compare this like cosmic notion that human beings are nothing special and everything is interconnected and we are nothing different from an object, really the end point or the destiny of post-humanism study in a Western frame is the beginning point, is the deserted hometown for African Caribbean culture or for American Indian culture or certain parts of Asian culture. It really is a backwards journey. They see, capitalism as the deviating force, as like where we arrive in the post-apocalyptic world. In very much so in Naylor Hopkinson's story, you start from a, men and women in one with nature place, and you arrive at capitalism, complete disaster. That is the journey in the Afrofuturism story. While in Mary Shelley's The Last Man, you start from a perfect, idyllic countryside, familial harmony, romanticized love, everything is going great, civilization, that is the starting point, to post-humanism, to the end when the world is destroyed and you have no other option than being the last man and go back to nature. So it's very much a reversed journey, and that is just fascinating, that comparison as well. And so I think this video has long exceeded my initial time budget, and this is where I'm going to wrap up. We've talked about putting Mary Shelley's The Last Man in conversation with 3 contemporary feminist dystopian novels, and compare the similarity, the influence, but also talk about the difference or the contradiction in each pair. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this video can be helpful to your reading or to your own writing in any sense. Thank you very much.